Hey guys, Mr. Terhar here with your e-learning lesson for April the 10th. Uh, Today's going to be a continuation. We'll actually kind of finish up talking about property taxes, and basically we'll finish talking about this, and then you will have some review questions to answer on Canvas for your e-learning assignment. So when we last met on Wednesday, we discussed property taxes and how basically the rate uh, or the amount that you have to pay in property taxes is determined. And we said that we have to assign a value to the property. And we talked about who did that, and it was a tax assessor. And the tax assessor is essentially a third party individual. It's usually an elected position, and that person is in charge of basically assigning value to all of the property in a given area. Typically, it's on a county by county basis. And we said that the way that we determine that value differs quite a bit depending on what type of property it is. If we're talking about a residential property, a place where, there's simply a house where people live, that property is assessed differently than farm ground because farm ground generates income. Um, it's measured more on its productivity, whereas a residential area is probably assessed more on the value of the house, the location of the house, based on how desirable that location is. We said that when it came to farm ground, we were assessing that farm ground based on its productivity levels. So, what is its yield? Over the course of several years, and we determine that based on productivity records, based on soil maps. All of those things go into play when it goes or when it comes down to determining the value of farmland. So we said that there were four types of farmland as well. That the first was cropland, and that could consist of obviously corn and soybeans, wheat fields, things of that nature. It could also, though, be vineyards, orchards, rotational pastures that we're currently or we're constantly rotating livestock through. They're not grazing them permanently. The second one, let's go back here so we can discuss them. Maybe there we go. Bear with me here, guys. The second was permanent pasture, which is land that we are constantly grazing livestock on. The third would be other farmland, woodlands, things like that. Also, farm building lots. So if we have a property where we have barns or grain bins or something like that. Um, and then finally, wasteland. And that's just land that is not put into cropland, permanent pasture, or other farmland uh, as a result of soil or natural resource limitations. So basically, it's land that's not suitable for agricultural production. So that brings us to what we're going to talk about today, and that is the methods that we use to assess the value of farmland and how do buildings change property tax amounts. Buildings are viewed as an improvement upon the land, so they typically add value to the land. Um, but how does that come into play? So the law requires that in order for a building to be assessed as an improvement to farm ground, that building has to be or has to contribute to the farm. In order to be assessed as part of the farm, the building has to be viewed as a contribution to the farm. So, for example, if you were to build a new pool house, okay, to go buy your pool to store pool chemicals and supplies and things like that, that would not be viewed as a farm building. That building doesn't contribute to the farm. It doesn't do anything for the farm. So it would be viewed as something that was not a farm building. It has to contribute. So we're talking things like grain bins, livestock facilities, barns, storage or tool sheds, shops, things like that. So the value is based on the current use of the buildings and their contribution to the farm. So what do they contribute to the farm? For example, grain bins contribute a lot financially to the farm. And, the ability to store grain contributes a lot to farm income because it allows you to do more with marketing. It allows you to have more flexibility in terms of, what you or when you have to sell your grain. So something like a grain bin contributes a lot to the farm. Whereas maybe an old corn crib that you just park, your tractor in. Uh, yeah, it contributes a little bit to the farm, but does it contribute as much as a grain bin? No, no. In the grand scheme of things, it does not. So uh, we have to basically agree on what the contribution to the farm is. One thing that the assessor has to keep in mind when they're assigning value to the building is depreciation. And we've talked about depreciation in the past in here. And just to review, what depreciation is it's the difference between the cost of actually replacing a building and its current value. So the example we use for depreciation a lot is a vehicle. Vehicles are notorious for their depreciation rate. If you buy a brand new truck for $40,000 and you drive it off the lot, it's worth $5,000 less almost instantly. Vehicles depreciate very quickly. So basically, property and buildings do the same thing. Over time, the buildings begin to age, they begin to, start to, um, wear out, they need repairs. It's just a natural progression. And naturally, buildings lose some of their value over time. Now, does that depreciation happen as quickly on a building as it does a vehicle? No, absolutely not. Property and buildings are actually very, very slow in terms of depreciation compared to other assets, but they do depreciate. So you have to take that into account. Uh, so what you have to consider is the value of that building in its current state, and then the cost of actually depreciate or actually replacing that building. So there's several different types of depreciation that we see. It can be seen in forms of physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, or economic obsolescence. So obsolescence is basically the process of becoming obsolete. The big word to just say it's obsolete now. So the first is physical deterioration. And physical deterioration is a loss in the physical ability to withstand normal use. So, uh, could result from use, natural wear and tear, structural defects, and decay. You drive down the road and you see it all the time. Old barns that set behind houses that at one point in time were probably used uh, quite heavily, but over the course of time, those barns have just been let go, and time has taken its toll on them, and they are to a point where either structurally they're not sound enough to really do much. Um, that's an example of physical deterioration. They've just gotten to the point where they're worn out. Okay, and that's one form of deterioration. The second is functional obsolescence. And functional obsolescence is a loss in value due to characteristics of the building that cause a failure of the building to serve its intended purpose. So basically, it's the ability. Functional obsolescence refers to a failure of the building to fulfill what it was supposed to do. So basically, if a building becomes too small or the operation outgrows that building, that could be viewed as functional obsolescence. Um, it's hard because physical deterioration and functional obsolescence are very, very similar. Um, basically physical deterioration is almost a severe form of functional obsolescence. The building just can't do what it's supposed to do anymore, therefore it becomes less desirable. And then finally, economic obsolescence. And economic obsolescence is a loss in a farm building's value because of the farm's economic environment. So this one is a little tricky because it involves several different factors. Land use changes, market conditions. For example, if you have, let's say that you have a beef cattle feedlot, okay, and that's one of your farm buildings, and the beef market tanks and cattle prices are in the toilet. That could be viewed as economic obsolescence for that facility because that facility's ability to generate money is very, very directly tied to the beef cattle market. And if beef cattle prices take a hit for an extended period of time, that could be viewed as economic obsolescence for that feedlot facility. Um, so basically, what we take into consideration is if that situation does play out, let's say that the tax assessor comes and he assesses the value of that property. Beef cattle market is very, very poor at the time. That goes into account. And after all that information is collected, there are cost tables that they can use to put correct value on buildings. So property assessment and property tax levy procedures vary from state to state, and they may vary slightly from county to county. But generally, the basic structure of how property taxes are assessed and levied is very, very similar. It follows the steps of assessment. The assessor determines the value of the property. The property value is reviewed by the property owner, and if they disagree with that assessment, they may appeal that to a judiciary committee. The state equalizes it, so the state kind of says, okay, we have to keep property taxes relatively equal from one county to the next. Uh, a budget is established by the local government, so they figure out, okay, we're going to have roughly this amount of money coming in terms of property tax revenue. What are we going to do with it? This much goes to funding the school corporations. This much goes to maintaining the roads. This much goes to funding our fire departments and our police departments, and so on and so forth. A tax rate is finally determined, and then finally property taxes are collected. And as we said, property taxes are paid on an annual basis. So one day a year, uh, or once a year, I should say, property taxes are collected. So as we said, the first step is assessment. The property is discovered, listed, and appraised by local assessor officials. And you might say to yourself, well, how do these assessors know if I'm making an improvement or if I'm building something? If I'm building onto my home, that's obviously going to change the value. How do they know that? Well, uh, the one of the ways they know that is that if you are going to make any sort of improvement, if you're going to build onto your home or build, anything really, you are required legally to get a building permit, and it's just a permit that gives you permission basically to make those improvements. And obviously, once you file for that building permit, that puts you on the grid, and the government knows, oh, Billy is building onto his home. Once that project is complete, we need to make sure we get an assessor out there to determine the value of that improvement. The second step, as we said, was the review. Uh, Obviously, most of the time, hopefully, you agree on the assessment, but not always. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there. We didn't get quite as far as what I wanted to, but I'm kind of almost to my 15-minute limit in terms of how long my video can be. So without further ado, I'll let you go. We have questions to answer, just like always on Canvas. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be glad to help. Thank you and have a great day.